The carbon footprint of beef.
In 2008, the EPA started looking at some concrete, realistic ways of combating climate change. And one thing they considered was taxing large emitters of greenhouse gases. And these are relatively large emitters of greenhouse gases. Cows are different than pigs and chickens in that they're ruminants. That means they have a very complex digestive system. Their stomachs actually contain 4 components. And cattle burp about once a minute, and when they burp, methane is expelled. And we're used to thinking of carbon as a greenhouse gas. Methane is too, but 1 ton of methane has 21 times the global warming effect than 1 ton of carbon does.
A quick note on terminology. Sometimes you'll hear me use the word methane, sometimes you'll hear me use the word carbon. Both methane and carbon dioxide are greenhouse gases. And there are other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, but in this lecture I'm only going to concentrate on methane and carbon dioxide. And whenever we talk about the total emissions of greenhouse gases from an animal, we don't want to first say how much methane was emitted, then how much carbon. It gets really messy. What we'd like to do is convert all greenhouse gases into one identical unit. And we do it like this. Suppose you have 1 ton of methane being emitted and 1 ton of carbon dioxide. What we do is we convert everything to carbon dioxide equivalents. It turns out that 1 ton of methane has the same warming effect as 21 tons of carbon dioxide, and often when we say carbon dioxide we just say carbon. And so when we put 1 ton of methane and 1 ton of carbon dioxide together, we convert it to its equivalent units of carbon, and that ends up being 22 tons of just carbon or carbon dioxide equivalent, however you want to say it. As you can imagine, calculating the right tax for each cow is not an easy thing to do. First, you have to know exactly how much methane a cow is emitting. And that may seem the hard part, but it isn't. As you look out on this group of cattle, you might think to yourself, how exactly do you know how much methane comes out of their once-a-minute burp throughout a day or a week? Well, scientists have contrived a rigorous way of estimating this. They devised a chamber where the cow's head is within the chamber for a given period of time, and air is brought into the cattle, and they can measure the methane concentrations of the air coming in, and then they have a thing that captures the air going out the chamber. They can measure the methane concentration of the air going out, and the difference in the methane concentration of the air going out minus the air going in is the additional methane the cattle contribute. Then once they have the amount of methane the cow is emitting through their burps, they have to figure out how much damage that methane is doing in terms of climate change. Now that, of course, is more guesswork than anything. It's a hard number to calculate, and what the EPA did, they calculated that the tax should be about $44 per ton of carbon emitted, and some groups then calculated that each cow emitted about 2 tons per head, and that's where the idea of the $88 per cow tax came from.
And of course, many ranchers didn't like that idea. Environmentalists thought it was just a sensible way of discouraging something that was bad. If carbon really does cause global warming and we want to reduce carbon, well, taxing it is one way of doing it. Once people started really taking seriously the contribution of livestock production to greenhouse gas emissions, they started crunching some numbers, and one report came out and said that all of the emissions from livestock production were more than all of the emissions from the transportation sector. And that caused great concern for many people, led some celebrities like Bill Maher to say that it is better to eat a salad in a Hummer than it is a burger in a Prius, meaning it's not transportation you need to worry about so much, but whether you're eating beef or not. Now, it turned out that those numbers were wrong. Once some animal scientists went in, found some flaws in the estimates and made the corrections, and everybody agreed that there were some corrections to be made. They found that emissions from the livestock sector is much lower than from the transportation sector. Of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., only about 3% come from livestock production compared to 26% from the transportation sector. So while livestock is responsible for far less global warming than the transportation sector, the contribution of livestock is real. And so if we're serious about climate change, we have to take those emissions seriously. Suppose that you want to reduce your carbon footprint. The carbon footprint meaning the total emissions of greenhouse gases that you are personally responsible for. Well, you might want to think about doing that by changing what you eat. Well, what has research said about the relationship between diet and one's carbon footprint? They found a number of things. One study found that people who eat a vegan diet did have a smaller carbon footprint than people who consume meat in their diet. Some other studies found different results. They found that sometimes a vegan diet had a higher carbon footprint compared to someone else's diet that had meat, so long as that meat was chicken or pork, or included eggs, or included milk. What did I just leave out there? I left out beef. Studies tend to find that any diet that does include beef will tend to have a higher carbon footprint than diets that do not include beef. And again, the reason comes back to cattle being ruminants. And so the environmentalist notion about beef cattle is that it's bad because it causes a lot of climate change. Now, what does the beef industry say in turn? Well, they have another response. The beef industry isn't really going to talk so much about the carbon footprint of beef as it is right now, or the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted right now. Instead, they're going to focus on how much the carbon footprint of beef has been shrunk over the last 30 years. Even if the carbon footprint of beef is large compared to other foods, that carbon footprint has shrunk considerably over the last century. Since 1977, the carbon footprint of beef has fallen 16%, and that's not because the cattle industry was out there trying to fight climate change, but because it was doing what it always does, continues to find ways to produce beef more efficiently. And whenever you produce something more efficiently, you're producing for every pound of beef, you're using less inputs. This means less water. We're talking about less land. We're talking about less corn and soybean meal and hay that has to be used to produce any 1 pound of beef. And whenever you use less of these inputs, well, the carbon footprint from those inputs falls, and so the carbon footprint from beef has fallen as well. So whenever you hear the environmentalists complain about the high carbon footprint of beef, the beef industry is going to respond by saying, yeah, but look how much it's fallen just since 1977. And the funny thing is, both are right. The environmentalists and the beef industry are touting the arguments that cater to their side, and they're both absolutely right. You know, another thing to consider, if we really did start a taxing carbon, then that would spur us to the beef industry to become even more efficient and to find even better solutions of reducing their carbon footprint. And some research has suggested that we could probably decrease the carbon footprint of beef even more, perhaps another 25%. And so for beef lovers out there, that would make beef a much more environmentally friendly food. Beef is the quintessential American food. It's there for us at almost at every turn. If you're low on money and you want a cheap but filling meal, you're very likely to go to a fast food outlet and buy a cheap combo meal and get a hamburger made with, of course, beef. Or if you're at a celebration, you want to really splurge and buy something you really love that's very expensive, you're very likely to buy a steak, again, beef. It's there for us at all facets of American life. And so if beef really does have a relatively high carbon footprint, and if we were made to pay a tax for that carbon, would it really dampen our lifestyle very much? Does this concern beef consumers? It probably shouldn't concern them all that much. Think about it this way. The average American, just by living an average life, is responsible for about 24 tons of carbon being emitted. But suppose you felt guilty from that 24 tons and you wanted to make your life carbon neutral, meaning you want to say, I want to do something where I take 24 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, such that you neither contribute any additional carbon from your daily life. You can do that very easy by going to a website like carbonfund.org, and for just $240 you can buy something, a carbon offset, where they go out and do activities that will suck about 24 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, making your life carbon neutral. $240, that's not very much, I don't think, to make your whole life carbon neutral. And so if it's just $240 to offset all the carbon you emit, what if you had to do something to offset all the carbon you emit just from your beef consumption? Probably wouldn't be that much. So although I understand we want to be concerned about higher beef prices, I don't think it'll be that big of a deal as many beef lovers might be scared of.
Beef, the carbon-friendly meat?
While some criticize beef for its high carbon footprint, others see it as a solution in the climate change battle. There's a documentary called Carbon Nation where they point out that if you take land that's been heavily tilled like this, where the soil's been turned many times from plowing, and when you till a soil and break it up like this, it sends lots of carbon into the atmosphere. If you take ground like that's been planted in corn and heavily tilled for years and years, and you convert it to a permanent grassland looking something like this, you're actually going to suck a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. And what happens is when you have grass growing like this, the grass takes carbon from the atmosphere and it stores it into its roots. And so long as those roots stay in the ground and you're not exposing it by tilling it, well, then that carbon is stored in the ground. And this documentary claimed that if you convert a lot of cropland to permanent grassland like this, that you could reduce the total carbon emissions from the U.S. by about 39%. That's a huge number. And of course, if you have lots of grassland, it makes sense that maybe you'd want to graze cattle on it. And there's some evidence to suggest that if you want a very healthy grassland, it's actually better to have cattle grazing on it. If converting cropland to permanent grassland really does sequester a lot of carbon in the soil, well then that may make beef not a carbon emitter but a carbon sink. And this has led a number of people to propose increasing consumption of grass-fed beef to lower the carbon footprint of their food. Now we should make a qualification about grass-fed. If you've learned about what happens at the cow-calf and the stocker stage of cow production, you've seen that for a majority of a cow's life, they are eating grass. So what is grass-fed beef? Grass-fed beef just means that the cows stay on grass like this or hay their entire lives. Regular beef is not grass-finished beef because after the cow is about a year old, they're taken to a feedlot like this one here, where there's no more pasture, less hay they consume. They eat a diet very high in grains. And so is it true that if we replace beef from a feedlot with beef that came from cows who were always on pasture, would it really reduce the carbon footprint of beef? The answer? I frankly don't know. I'm trying to figure that out myself. Here's some of the things we do know. We do know that producing grass-fed beef requires a lot more inputs in the form of more feed, more water, more land, and all that results in more carbon emissions. It also takes a cow longer to reach the slaughtering stage when they're raised as grass-fed beef. The normal beef cattle in a feedlot, they'll be slaughtered between 15 and 18 months of age, whereas grass-fed beef, they're sometimes 22, 24-year-old when the time they're slaughtered. That means if they're living longer, there's more years where they're burping. And so long as they're living longer, they're going to be emitting a lot more methane in their burps. And so that's a number of many real reasons why grass-fed beef would actually have a higher carbon footprint than regular beef. But what about that soil sequestration thing? Well, if it was true that converting lots of cropland to grassland like this, if it really did sequester a lot of carbon in the soil, and if it sequestered so much that it made up for all the additional carbon that resulted from more feed, more water, more land, and the cattle living longer, then maybe it's possible that grass-fed beef could have a lower carbon footprint. Right now, when we're crunching the numbers, it seems possible but not likely that grass-fed beef has a lower carbon footprint. But maybe that's something that we'll change our mind about once we get more information.